before you get started, it's good to press out your strips, just to make sure there aren't any folds or creases, and you have the whole thing to work with. So I'm going to piece a Judy Niemeyer pattern, paper piecing, and I'm going to do it with these pinked strips because they end up being smaller than the 2.5 inches that you need. So to start off, we start with our dark strips. I don't cut them in the 14.5 inch length that they ask you to, because then you have an inch of waste on each end of the pattern. So I keep them in a full strip. And the first step is to trim your pattern so that you're right up to the black edges, unlike you learn and you're supposed to leave a little bit on each end. I don't, because we have very little fabric to work with. So you turn your pattern over. On section 1, you put your first layer of glue. You just need a quick strip of glue to hold your fabric steady. And you put your fabric wrong side to the wrong side of the pattern. Not using batik fabrics because those don't really have a wrong side, and I want to be able to show you how to do this with fabrics that do have a right and wrong side. So once that's stuck, you turn it over, and I scissor trim the end to match the end of the pattern, or very close to it, and I don't end up with as much waste at the end. Now the next step is to take your plastic template and line it up on line 1. Make sure you can read line 1, that it's not upside down, and you fold the paper towards yourself on that line over the template. And you use your add a quarter ruler to trim off the excess fabric. Make sure you don't stray away from the ruler. Every inch of fabric, every millimeter of fabric is really important. So that gets saved. Now typically at this point you take your second fabric and you put it underneath and you let a little bit of it show. In this case, because they're pinked edges, I'm going to turn the paper open again so that I can see my right side of my fabric. I'm going to match the right sides together, and I'm going to take the pinked edge and I'm going to just match the tips of the pinking to the edge that I just cut. And this is going to save you 1/8 of an inch of fabric every time you do it. And then again, you're supposed to glue it, so I just lift up my fabric, give it a couple dabs of glue to hold it into place so I don't have to pin. I'm going to trim off the end of my fabric, it's excess, and I'm going to do it with scissors. And now I can go ahead and flip it up and I can stitch my first seam, which is line 1. You don't need to backtrack on the beginning and ends of the seams, you just stitch it out. And I have my machine set on a smaller stitch. It's 1.5 instead of the 2.5 that it's normally set at. And that's so that it makes more puncture holes and the paper will rip away easier when you're ready to take the paper off. Okay, so the next step is to open it up, and it gets pressed open. Alright, so I pressed it open. Now the next step is to trim off the extra. So you flip it back so you're reading your words the correct way, and now we're on line 2. We do the same thing, we put our template on that black line 2, and we fold the paper toward us on that line. You can see I've already drawn my seam allowance lines, and that helps me line up the next piece. I forgot to tell you that when you stitch and this line 2 is overlapped here, you're supposed to tear away that little piece so that you can get a better fold. So once again, you use your add a quarter ruler, you butt it up against the plastic template that's in there, and you trim, making sure you don't stray away from your ruler. This gets saved. So you open it up. Then what I do, which is not what you're supposed to do, but it's been working for me, is I flip the pattern over. I'm looking at the right sides. I can see where my seam allowance is, and I'm working on section 3 now. At this point, I'm saving that one that was pre-cut for the very, very last piece. So I'm just going to take my fabric. I'm going to, once again, line it up so that the pinked edges aren't hanging over too much. You can see that the tips are just about hanging a little tiny bit, and you can see the fabric underneath it. That's how I glue it. So I'm trying to save as much, conserve as much in the width of the fabric as I possibly can. And you only need a couple of little spots to hold it in place. You don't need a whole lot of glue. So you bring it to your machine. It's already opened up. You have to make sure you're sewing on line 2. And that long strip, I didn't cut it before I sewed, so I'm going to cut it now. And it just has to be a little bit over the edge of the fabric. Now when I open it up, it's ready to be pressed. Okay, so I've pressed it open. I flip it back. I'm going to take the little seam that's overlapped. I'm going to tear it away. I'm going to take my template and I'm going to line it up on line 3. You keep the plastic in there so you have something to butt your ruler up against. This add a quarter ruler. It has that little lip on it. And you trim off your excess fabric. Again, you're left with a piece that you're going to use later. Now I open up my paper, take my template out, I flip the paper over. Now I'm going to do the yellow. Here's my yellow piece that's already cut. I want to make sure it's going to be wide on this end because I'm working on number 4 and narrow on the other end. So I'm going to look at it like this. Is how I'm going to want it to fit in here. And I want the pieces right side together. So I put them right sides together. And once again, I don't overlap those tips too far. I let the bottom fabric show through. So I flip it over so that I'm reading the section numbers properly. The paper's to my right. And I'm on the line number 3. So you flip it over to the back, and you open up your seams, and you can see I'm really close to the pinking, but it's still going to grab it. So there's no need to have extra fabric hanging over there. Now when I finger press it open, you can see it's going to make it past my seam allowance line, this line right here. It makes it way past it, so I know I have plenty of room for a seam. After I've trimmed this. I'm just finger pressing this one open. Again, to trim it, we're pulling away this little corner where it crosses and overlaps. Very little scrap when you're making this quilt. That's a piece of scrap. Not much. Open it up. I flip it over so the fabric is facing up. Then I can look at this section number 5 that I'm going to fill next. And to make sure that the fabric is going to be enough fabric, I lay it down on there, and look at that, there's plenty of fabric. So again, I put it right sides together. I let a little bit of the bottom fabric show through. I glue it in place and I sew it. See, I have such a big piece of fabric here that I can see it's going to be plenty. I'm letting those tips hang over just a little bit to make sure I have a good enough seam. And I'm on line number 4. see, I've caught the whole thing. Nothing's poking any holes. It's all caught in the seam. So here we're going to trim it off, and you can see there's hardly any excess fabric, but there's still plenty of seam allowance. And the whole seam's caught. There aren't any holes. None of the pinking is causing any issues. So we're going to open it up. Okay, so it's pressed. I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to tear away that little corner again so that I can bend it over my template. Line number 6. I'm actually angling my blade in a little bit, kind of under the ruler, which is giving me a little extra space too on that piece of fabric, a little extra width. Now to match up my fabric. If you glue the whole edge, you're going to run out of glue really quick. These Fons and Porter glue sticks, they're refillable, but you'll go through a couple of them to make this whole quilt, so you don't need a lot, just a couple of dabs. Now I have this tail left over. This is what's left of my entire piece. This is going to end up being a scrap piece. And we're sewing line number 6. It gets pressed, and then it gets trimmed. Working on line number 7. Again, I'm angling this a little bit, so it's kind of going under the ruler. Not by much. Now I need the orange again. I have one already cut. I can look at it and see if it's going to fit in this section 8. And there's enough, it looks like that there's enough for a seam on both edges when I look at it, and it only has to go to this point, so I think I'm going to have enough fabric there. It's these narrow pieces near the end of the block that everyone has trouble with, and they end up with not enough width in the strips. So I'm just trying to show that yes, there is going to be enough here. Number 7. Now let's flip it up and see if there's going to be enough to fill that gap. Look at that. It goes right up to the line that I pre-drew for the seam allowance. Now that's the seam allowance line. So the seam's going to be inside of that. So we have a whole 1/4 inch seam allowance still. This is one of the last pieces. This is going to get pressed. I got a 1/4 ruler on it. When you look at that, there's hardly anything to trim off. But we're going to trim it anyway. And if it went inside that ruler line and there wasn't anything to trim off, we'd still have some kind of a seam in there. Okay, so it's ready to flip over and sew. We're on number line number 8. Almost there. Okay, here we are at the end of the block, and I have again just another piece that we can trim off and use for scrap. Never use steam when I'm pressing it because that distorts the fabric. So it's good to use just a dry iron. So here's our finished block. When we tip it over, we want the block to be exactly the size of the paper. When we started right on the edge of the paper, so that side doesn't need to be trimmed, but the other sides do. So we just take our ruler, line it up with the outside edge of the paper, which is that little black line. Trim away the excess. This is the Judy Niemeyer Stepping Stones quilt, and this is the unit number J, letter J, of the pattern, which actually has 11 sections. Some of the other units only have 10. So this shows you that it's the biggest unit and it had enough fabric. Oops. Let's try that again. There we go. So, other than that little oops I just did, there's our finished block. All done. So those are my helpful hints on how to use pink strips when working with the Judy Niemeyer paper pattern. Thanks for watching.